Hi everyone, I'm speaking to Jared Taylor, who's a mildly controversial figure. Jared, you've been doing this for quite a long time, haven't you?
Yes, I have been a white advocate for 27 years. It's quite a long time.
Right, okay.
Perhaps longer than you've been alive. I'm not sure.
No, I'm actually 38 now, so
Ah, well, very good.
yeah, getting old in the tooth, long in the tooth. So why would you call yourself a white advocate specifically, and not a different term which you may well be called in the media?
Well, the terms that the media far prefer are white supremacist and racist. All of those terms are pejorative, and I feel as though my views are perfectly congruent with human nature and history and unimpeachably moral. So I reject any term that is pejorative. White supremacist also is just, I think, factually incorrect. I think that's a historic term that really should be retired because to me, it means someone, a white person, who wishes to rule over people of other races, and I don't know anyone who has that desire. Most people with my views just want to be left alone, to be able to pursue our own destiny, as we wish to leave everyone alone to pursue their destiny too. So the whole idea is to use words that discredit people with whom others disagree.
I agree. That's certainly the tactic of the progressive mainstream. So, would you consider yourself, I don't know, a segregationist?
No, because segregationist, that implies force. I believe in complete freedom of association. And when most people are free to associate, they prefer to be with people who are similar to themselves, not just in terms of race, but often in terms of religion, in terms of cultural preferences. In fact, there was a very interesting study about workplace preferences. And when people were allowed to express those preferences anonymously, they not only said they preferred to be with people of the same race, but of the same sex, the same age, and same general level of education. Those are the sorts of people with whom people are most comfortable at the workplace. And so given complete freedom of association, and if we could persuade the United States government and our institutions to recognize that this kind of preference is perfectly moral, I think that we could arrange for a peaceful and mutually beneficial separation.
Right. So that's very interesting because I mean the first thing that strikes me is if people naturally self-segregate without the use of force, obviously. What's
Yes.
the need for any kind of activism at all? Because surely the white people are kept separate from the black people by dint of inclination.
Because every institution in the United States, from the president on down, is constantly promoting this view that I think runs against human nature, namely the idea that we should wish to be with people as unlike ourselves as possible, that diversity is a strength, and that, for example, if through immigration whites become a minority in the United States, that will simply be a joyful future to which we should look forward because this will be the ultimate expression of diversity. And most whites, I believe, in their bones, feel that this would be very bad for them, for their culture and for their offspring, but they don't dare say so because of this rigidly dominant orthodoxy according to which any expression of white solidarity or white racial consciousness is considered evil.
See, that seems counter to my own experiences, and perhaps it's just that we exist in different environments. But I find that most white people don't want to have a racial identity ascribed to them. And I find that a lot of non-white people are the same way. They want to move beyond the shackles of social constraint via race. Do you not think that that's something that they should be free to pursue?
Oh, if people wish to live in diversity, if they like diversity, they should be free to enjoy it. But certainly my experience here in the United States is that blacks overwhelmingly have a racial consciousness. Hispanics likewise, Asians to a somewhat lesser degree, but they all have a sense of their collective interests. And that's why, just at the drop of a hat, you can accumulate hundreds, sometimes thousands of blacks who will demonstrate, sometimes violently, in what they take to be their own interests. Very difficult to get whites to do that. You can get Hispanics into the streets as well. And that is why blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, they all have political pressure groups. They all have organizations, nonprofit groups, that are set up explicitly to advance their interests, and if need be, at the expense of whites. It's only whites who do not have that kind of thing. And I think you would, with only the greatest of difficulty, find, for example, a black person who is not conscious of being black, who has a sense of solidarity with other blacks, and who feels that his fate is entwined with those of other blacks. And blacks who do not feel that way are somewhat embarrassed. They're considered Uncle Toms, they're looked down upon by other blacks, and I think they would hesitate to make a public profession of a lack of interest in the collective interest of blacks.
I don't contest what you've said there. I totally agree that there is very much a strong black racial consciousness among black people, and, like you say, to Hispanics and whatnot. But I see these things as being rather a regression back from the intellectual and personal development that we had managed to achieve, at least briefly, during the sort of 1990s, where it was kind of a taboo subject to promote your race, at least in Britain anyway. Perhaps it wasn't in America. But it wasn't... I mean, we saw a lot of American media, and it wasn't saturated with what we see now. And so it seems to me that the Democrats are unwitting racists, still punishing black people by reinforcing this kind of racial identitarianism. And I don't think it's a good idea to try and push that on white people. I think that I would feel the same way about it.
Racial identitarianism in the United States goes back a long, long way. Don't forget this, I'm black and I'm proud. Black is beautiful. Those slogans go back to the 1960s. And perhaps you'll remember at the Olympics, there were black track athletes who took the medal stand with a raised fist. That was back in the 1960s or early 70s. This sense of blacks as being a nation within a nation. It goes back to Marcus Garvey. It goes back to people like W.B. Du Bois. There is a very, very vivid sense that they are here as a captive people and do not belong. You would find the same thing with American Indians. It goes back a long, long way. And when people talk about how, we'll have no trouble assimilating the Mexicans and the Haitians and the Guatemalans because we assimilated the Hungarians and the Italians and the Jews and the French, those people overlook the fact that there have been these two different racial groups living in the United States since long before the arrival of European ethnics who to this day are not assimilated. And that is because, in my view, race, biological differences, those are the most difficult barriers to cross in terms of any kind of meaningful assimilation. But just to reiterate, the idea of racial consciousness is something that has very, very deep roots in the United States, including among white people. You would probably have a very, very difficult time finding a major political figure in the United States or a major intellectual figure, except for a few outliers, a white person that did not have a sense of the United States being a nation that was an extension of Europe, that was to always be that way and would always have a white majority. This was something always taken for granted until perhaps the 1950s, 60s. So my view of race is one that is far more faithful to that of the Founding Fathers and to the American conception of the United States up until just a relatively small number of decades ago.
That's a really interesting response. So there are a few things. The first one being that legitimizes the argument from the far left, though, doesn't it? By saying, I mean, you're basically making the exact same argument. America had a very racialized past due to the unique circumstances of its conception, and so this is something we should continue on, because they would be more than happy to continue that as well. It's just who has the whip hand in the situation, whereas I would prefer to move beyond that and abandon that altogether and approach it in a more, I guess, humanistic way.
Well, don't forget this conception of whites as a group with distinct interests is by no means unique to the United States. The French and the British empires reflected a sense of race. I'm sure you're aware, people like Cecil Rhodes or the colonizers, Lord Lugard, who was that wonderful general who was involved? Garnet Wolseley. He was involved in practically every 19th century campaign overseas. They all had a very vivid sense of whites as being sort of the self-governing race. The British in particular, they were the self-governing and therefore the race that had the capacity to govern others. There's a very, very distinct sense of being a people with a mission. So it's not at all exclusive to the United States, but in Britain as well. I think perhaps even to an even more extraordinary degree, it is only in the last few years that this sense of destiny that the British people had, which I think was a remarkable thing, has been completely beaten out of them. This sort of, typical bloody Britain. If something goes wrong in Britain, or if the British athletes don't do so well in international sports, I think this is a terrible loss. So, no, it's not unique to the United States. The French as well had this mission civilisatrice.
Maybe I should have said the West then. I'm aware that 100 years ago plus, science was very racial. Anyone considered to be partaking in scientific thinking would have had distinct racial dimensions to it, and I mean I'm well aware of all of that. But that's exactly the point that we make towards the far left, is that we don't live in that condition now. Most people, I think, don't want to view the world in a racialized conception. At least if they do, I don't see the evidence for it. And it's interesting how you hark back to the sort of founding fathers of your nation, because isn't that the inherent contradiction of the United States, though? You know, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and yet they were slaveholders and had a race that they considered to be subhuman, enslaved for them. I mean, to return to that mindset would it not necessarily require you to regard black people as less than human?
No, not at all. This is a boogeyman of the left.
Right.
I remember having a conversation years ago with a leftist on this whole question of racial differences in IQ. And she was quite a committed leftist, and I was making some of the, I think, more powerful arguments, pointing out the evidence for this average IQ difference and why the IQ difference has probably got a substantial genetic contribution to it. And then she absolutely astonished me by saying, well, if that's true, we'll just have to exterminate them all. What? No, not at all. Not at all. Yes, you could have knocked me down with a feather. This kind of, and as I say, this was an absolute committed liberal who seemed to think that all of her conceptions of race depended on this assumption of equality, and if that were knocked out, then everything just completely fell apart. No, there's even Jim Crow South, even at the time when lynching was considered an appropriate punishment for black criminals, no one ever thought that, well, we just have to exterminate them all. Never. There was, of course, in the United States, a strong movement to free blacks and then repatriate them to Africa or some other part outside the United States. But no, the idea that this means some kind of subhuman, that's never been the case. Furthermore, I think it's important to point out the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was simply an expression of the United States' wish to part company with the colonial ruler. That passage, all men are created equal, by no means is reflected in the Constitution of the United States, which is a very inegalitarian document. When it came time to set the rules for how the United States was going to operate as a political entity, there's no idle chatter about egalitarianism. The purpose of that document, I believe, and that phrase, is to say to King George III and the people who were in the American eyes riding roughshod over their colonies, to say, look, you and I are equal. We are men just like you, and we choose to go our separate ways. And then there's this list of particulars of injustices that the colonists felt had been perpetrated against them.
Yeah.
So that is by no means any expression of general equality. The guy who wrote it, Thomas Jefferson, he was a slaveholder. It's very clear in his notes on Virginia that he did not think that blacks on average were as intelligent as whites. He had all sorts of speculations about how different races were different.
If I can interrupt there, sorry, that's not entirely my point. I mean, I'm not suggesting that any race, any individual is the exact same or the direct equal of another. I think that's a ridiculous conception. But
Yes.
the values themselves are universal. And if you accept the premise that black people are human, then it must apply to them too. And so then to suggest that any action should be taken against black people on the basis that they're black isn't really anything to do with their actual qualities. It seems to come from prejudices.
No, because people who are 16 years old are also human, but we don't give them the vote. We don't let them drive automobiles. We don't draft them for the military. We make distinctions on the basis of sex, on the basis of age, on the basis of education, and race is a biological phenomenon. Now, if you take in small numbers of individuals, it is entirely possible, and we have seen examples of this, of what I would call near total assimilation. However, once the number of minorities reaches a certain critical mass, then assimilation becomes very difficult. And in the United States, to this day, despite the fact that more than a half a century has gone by since the glory days of the civil rights movement, we still have race riots. We still have blacks and whites who will view the same phenomenon and have a completely different conception of what's happened. This, to me, is evidence that we should not attempt to live together in large numbers. We will be happier if we go our separate ways. And so this idea that diversity is a tremendous strength of the United States, to me, is clearly a preposterous, complete fantasy. Well, the diversity of this kind is a source of conflict.
That's rather getting away from my point, though. I was really thinking on a sort of moral level. I mean, in what way are you morally justifying discriminating against black people because they're black? That's the question. Because if you believe that all men are created equal, and you believe that black people are also men, then on what grounds are you trying to discriminate against them?
Very good. First of all men are not created equal. There's not two single humans who are created equal.
I mean their rights. I don't mean the. I'm not a leftist. I mean they are equal in the rights under the law.
Well, I believe you are a great proponent of individual liberty. And individual liberty means individual choice.
Yes.
I believe that if you prefer to not associate with someone, you have every right to do so, whether your reasons are good or bad or none at all. You should have the right to refuse to deal with people because, after all, you've not hurt them. For example, if I'm captivated by some screen star and I think she's absolutely beautiful and I'm convinced I could make her happy, I approach her and she says, too bad, I don't want to associate with you. She owes me no explanation as to why she does not. It might be possible that I could make her happy, but no one would think that she's compelled to spend time with someone she does not wish to spend time with. Likewise, if my conception of a society is one that reflects the values of Europe, the culture of Europe, the kind of texture of life that Europeans create, and if my view is, and it's based, I think, on unimpeachable evidence, that if other people arrive in large numbers, they will change that texture of life. They will divert the direction of that culture. They will change the destiny of a certain people. Then I think I have every right voluntarily to say, no, I prefer the company of my people. I prefer to preserve the ways of my ancestors, and that I have every right to work to see that they will continue into the future. Your way of looking at things, it seems to me, will eventually mean that there's no distinction at all, that India will become indiscriminate and indistinguishable from Korea, that Turkey will be like Argentina. No. I want all of those places to remain unique and beautifully original, beautifully distinct.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I don't think that my conception will result in that. I'm not for mass immigration, but not for reasons of race, incidentally, for several other reasons. And I completely agree with you when you say that people should be free to associate with whoever they want. I have no problem with white identitarians deciding to move to an area and live together. I have absolutely no problem with that. And just, I think, by reputation alone, that would discourage non-white identitarians from moving to that area. I think that's completely fine. And I'm the same with black separatists, with communists forming their silly communes in the woods or whatever it is they want to do. For me, this is, we actually, we live in systems that are more than capable of sustaining this, and that's people's free choice. But the problem for me is when it comes to the point where you make it sound, and maybe not just you, maybe not you specifically, but for example, if you've got someone called Richard Spencer hosting the National Policy Institute, it's a rather grandiose name for something that is rather small, but the intent is clearly to direct public policy, and I don't think that you can do what you want in a non-coercive way through government intervention. I think there's only a coercive way to do that, and then that strikes me. Sorry if I'm going on, but then you've got the moral quandary, because I mean, the left isn't entirely wrong in the moral deficiency of the treatment of black people in the United States historically. They were taken from Africa, they were enslaved, and then afterwards they were left to their own devices and not treated particularly well by the wider culture. Do you not think that to then say, right now you all have to get out, is a little bit unjust?
You're talking about, it seems to be two different things here. Okay. First of all, I don't think that compulsion is necessary. Right. The United States government, as it's set up today, is in the business of doing its damnedest to bring people together. We have abrogated the right that you have just affirmed of free association. If I'm an employer, I cannot simply hire left-handed people. Well, I guess I could, because that's not a protected class. If I am a black employer and I'm running a nightclub that is frequented by blacks, I don't have the right to hire an all-black staff, although no one will bother you if you do. If you're a white person, then you'd come under scrutiny. We should have complete freedom to do what we wish to do. The government is vigilant to make sure that this does not happen, that schools are integrated, work sites are integrated, neighborhoods integrated. As I say, every institution in American society is based on the idea that integration is a good thing, to the point where very, very few whites, despite the fact that they live in segregated neighborhoods and they send their children to largely white schools, very few whites would dare say, well, yeah, of course I prefer to live in a white neighborhood. So if the government got out of the business of fighting human nature and encouraged the expression of healthy human nature, I do not think that compulsion would be required. At the same time, there can be incentives built in for people to be asked or paid to return to their country of origin. The French have tried this. The Germans have tried this. These things don't work very well because they don't control this process very well. And an Algerian that has accepted $500 or $5,000 to go back to Algeria slips in and asks for another $5,000.
You can't pay people to leave. We learned that with the Vikings.
The Vikings were in a position to take the money and come back anyway.
Well, that's the Algerian will as well, won't he? He'll slip through. So, for anyone listening, we just had to pause there, and we've both forgotten what the last topic was. But yeah, so I'm not. You mentioned that you would prefer to have freedom of association, and I'm fine with that. I don't think most white people are going to necessarily choose to live away from black people. I think they'll choose to live somewhere that suits their individual preferences, and these can be anything. I do think you're strongly over-emphasizing the role of race in that. I think most people are more concerned with more immediate things like housing prices, the quality of the schools, the job that they might be moving to get. But so you wanted to take me to task over something about that?
No, I'm not taking you to task. Okay. I think you're probably mistaken about certainly the preferences of white people. Yes, they're concerned about house prices. They could get a far nicer house for far less money if they were willing to accept this house along with black or Mexican neighbors. They would also find that their commute into the downtown is much shorter if they were prepared to accept black or Mexican neighbors. They would find that there are neighborhood schools within walking distance if they were prepared to send their children to classes in which whites are a minority. All of these things are, of course, part of the consideration, but whites, by and large, at least in the United States, are prepared to sacrifice those advantages because when they are farther out and they have longer commutes, and they have more expensive housing, perhaps a 25-minute bus ride to their school, they can be among people with whom they're comfortable. So I think whites, by and large, if there were acceptance of the idea of separation, which you may derisively consider tribal, but tribal sentiment, I think, is a powerful and legitimate thing. If this were accepted, and if more and more whites were expressing that preference, I think you'd be surprised at how small the number would be who wished to remain in the multi-culti areas rather than going with their tribe.
That's interesting, because I think you're over. I agree that humans are tribal. They absolutely are. But again, I think you overemphasize the racial nature of that. I mean, religion is a good example of this. There are Islam is a fantastic example. Islam is almost completely aracial. It just simply doesn't care whether the Muslim is black, white, yellow, whatever. It cares that they're Muslim or not, and it cares very, very strictly about this. And so you'll find very multicultural jihadi groups of, where Muslims will travel across the world to get involved in jihad warfare. This isn't something that bothers them, but they're concerned primarily about the religious nature of the tribalism, and I think that applies for almost not. I mean, you do obviously get racial identitarianism, but it's just one form of tribalism, and I think. Sorry. Go on.
Well, the example what I would give is that when there are prison riots in the United States, it's not the Methodists trying to kill the Baptists.
No.
It's not the people from Minnesota trying to kill the people from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It is blacks, Hispanics, and white people trying to kill each other. It's the same if there's a riot in a school. They don't riot. It's not the 11th graders trying to gang up on the 9th graders, or the football team trying to beat up the hockey team. These expressions of hostility invariably fall along racial lines. And so I agree that human beings are tribal in a variety of ways. And Europeans, despite being the same race, have slaughtered each other with incredible diligence over what, in retrospect, seem utterly minor differences. But when push comes to shove, because race is a biological fact, because race cannot be concealed, because, in effect, we wear our uniform on our face 24 hours a day, this is, to me, obviously, where you find multiracialism, you find these ruptures, it is one that is very, very difficult to overcome. Now,
do you mind if I jump in there? Sorry,
yes,
yeah.
Please.
Only because it's relevant. You bring up prison rights. That's a really interesting example. I'm sure in the United States that's exactly as you say, because the black people carry a strong racial identity with them. But in Britain, that's not really the case. In Britain, it's actually Muslim versus kuffar, black or white. I mean, a large number of the English Defence League, which is a specifically anti-Islam group, had many non-white people in it who just simply were not Muslim. I think that for you that's the tribal line, that's what you're perceiving, but I don't think that's a universal at all, and I think that there are many examples to show that.
Well, Islam is extraordinary in the extent to which it does seem to be able to paper over race. Of course, Islam is an all-consuming religion. It is not just a religion. It's a means for organizing society, organizing male-female relations. It really is an architectonic. It's to fill every crevice of one's life. And if there is an ideology that can suppress race, at least for the time being, I think Islam has that capacity. On the other hand, I don't want to subscribe to something that is as suffocating as Islam. I want to be free to think what I want, have my own decisions, and it's unusual to find something that can suppress race to that extent.
Well, I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I think communism does the same thing, and honestly,
no.
You don't think so?
No.
You don't think so?
Oh, the Russians and the Chinese.
Oh, I'm not saying that they
couldn't get along.
No. It's just I think it's exactly the same as the Enlightenment values founding the U.S. The values themselves supersede racial barriers and identities. And I think given enough time, I think they would absolutely find race irrelevant. But either way, it's at least nice to be able to demonstrate that, look, race is not the be-all and end-all. It's not the totality. And I think that for I think the cases you're thinking of are mainly culturally in the US. And I mean, you've got, like, countries like Zimbabwe or South Africa that have got similar colonial histories, and they have very much a racialized view of these things as well. But that's because of their histories and their contexts. And it's not something that they're necessarily... I mean, they don't have to be bound by it. It's just, I think identity is really important and it's really strong.
You will find the same black identity everywhere in Africa. I remember traveling... I remember traveling in the Ivory Coast in the late 1970s and admiring how successful it was. And that was a time when there was a great deal of French government participation in running the country. And Ivory Coast was called the Japan of West Africa. Well, it was only maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there were these anti-white riots in Ivory Coast, which had been so successful. It was an expression again of the African desire to live free from any kind of white tutelage. This was not very widely reported in the West, but there was a great deal of anti-white violence, and many whites left. And Ivory Coast, I don't think, is ever going to recover in quite the same way. And it's not just in Zimbabwe. It's not just in South Africa, of course, where I think eventually we're going to have white people just streaming out of South Africa with the clothes on their backs. I don't think that multiracialism is going to work in the long term there. And the same was true in Congo. When Congo was independent, massacres of whites. Same thing in Mozambique, same thing in Angola. The Portuguese were sent packing. And now there's kind of an uneasy coexistence between this expatriate community and a kind of resentful, larger African presence. I don't think multiracialism works very well anywhere in Black Africa. I don't think multiracialism works well anywhere. And if you look at Sudan, they finally split the country into two because the blacks in the south felt very much disadvantaged and persecuted by the Arab north. No, these things just don't work out.
Well, you say the Arab North. Sorry, you did say Sudan, right?
Sudan, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, that's clearly a religious schism. A religious problem.
It's not just religious. You were describing the religious riots in British prisons, but I'm sure that the Sons of the Prophet versus the Kafirs, this also is likely to have a strong racial element as well.
Well, it doesn't necessarily. I mean, they don't seem to be expressing it in any way that's measurable. And there are white converts to Islam. There are black people and my goodness, ex-Muslims get it the worst. So I don't think that there is a racial dimension to that. But I find it. There was something you said there that you saw the. I don't know about the particular history of the Ivory Coast that you're speaking to, but you said that it was an expression of. Was it the black man wanting to be free from the white man, or something similar to that?
Yes.
Do you not think? I mean, we seem to not be giving enough credit where it's due to the neo-Marxists, and this is something that I think is entirely traceable. You can see the effect, and for example, in Britain, we've had our racial history and we've had race riots, but it really doesn't seem to be, or it didn't seem to be as bad as within the last 10 years or so. But that's because we've had neo-Marxists in the media who have decided that, in fact, Marxist theory should be applied along lines of race, and they're effectively stoking this up. And you can see the same thing with the Democrats in the United States. I mean, you see, like the latest transgender person who was approaching police and got shot. I have video of black people rioting to that, and they've racialized it, and it's nothing to do with race. It was white cops shooting a white person, and now you have black people rioting. This isn't an expression of the fact that they're black, really. It's an expression of the identity they have been pummeled with by the media and by the progressives who tell them, yes, you should have a black racial identity, you should feel aggrieved, in fact, you should get out in the streets and do something. And that's the implicit message behind everything they do, because they hate, well, white people, frankly.
Who hates white people?
The far left, the
yes.
neo-Marxists.
Yes. Well, don't forget, it is possible to stoke these resentments because they are there. I don't think they even need stoking. When you had black riots in the United States in the 1960s, you did not have this overwhelming media message. You deserve to have a chip on your shoulder. You have been kicked around. It is understandable if you riot. They rioted because they hated the society that they lived in.
But in the 60s, that's probably understandable, isn't it?
Well, the fact is, because of racial differences in ability, blacks in large numbers will never be achieving at the same level as whites. And when you have blacks rioting in Britain, well, it's just a few years ago, there was a black man who was shot by a policeman in London. And we had these horrific images of magnificent buildings going up in flames, blacks looting.
The 2011 riots.
Yes. Extraordinary stuff.
Well, okay, let me just interject there, because I was paying close attention to that. That wasn't really ethnic. That was class. No, I know. Honestly,
how many white people? How many white people?
Oh, there were loads. Loads of white chavs, we call them.
Well, those were probably opportunists who had.
No. Honestly, in Britain, it's class. In Britain, it's class. The main fault lines in our society are between, and it's not even necessarily rich or poor. What it is class culture that they're objecting to. But in Britain we have an underclass of people called chavs, and they're very multiracial. Lots of white people in there, lots of non-white people, and the BBC and various other news outlets were interviewing these people and saying, what's the problem? And they were saying, we want to be in charge, we want to have the money. They weren't arguing on forms of race, and there wasn't any racial homogeneity about them. It was a class issue, I promise you.
To the extent that there were groups of whites and groups of blacks rioting, I suspect that they were operating independently of each other.
No, not at
all. And you mean our drinking buddies are black and Jamaican and white and who knows what all else, and a few Bulgarians and Poles thrown together. Yes. We're going to riot together. Well.
It was overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly poor. That was the main. I mean, there wasn't a racial dimension as far as I could tell. If there was no evidence for it.
The photographs and the footage seemed pretty racially bifurcated to me, but I will concede to your better acquaintance with your home country. But let me get back to a point you made earlier, sure. And that was your acceptance of the idea that if whites wish to establish their own communities, they should have the right to do so. Now, does that not also accept the idea of white regions, white states, even white nations? If these can be achieved peacefully, would you consider them to be legitimate goals?
Well, I mean, I think it's the way you're phrasing it there that I take exception to. The idea of a white community, if it's people moving to an area on their individual choice to live in an area that they want to live in, and the area happens to be entirely white, I don't care. If it is somehow to do with regulation preventing non-white people from moving there, then I care. I mean, for example, Iceland is basically the white ethno-state that the alt-right is looking for. I'm looking for evidence that there are non-white people in Iceland, and I've yet to find it. But no one seems to want to move there. No one's interested in that, even though that's exactly what the alt-right would be looking for. I think that really what it is not about the white ethno-state specifically. It seems that it's coming from, well, it's about identitarianism, isn't it? That's all. Well, as far as I can tell, all this really is. It's not necessarily to do with the merits of the thing either. Because I mean, if you look at like the crime rates, for example, I mean, if like one of the things that the alt-right will say regularly, this is as if they have the genetic proof that blacks are inherently predisposed to criminality, to savagery of some sort. That doesn't explain why that wasn't expressing itself before the welfare state.
Oh gosh, it was expressing itself in Africa, all right. You ever heard of Shaka Zulu, the kind of extraordinary brutality?
I don't think that's a fair comparison.
Oh,
Because
I don't. No, I think it is a fair comparison.
why?
That is blacks in the state of nature, if you will. Blacks acting as blacks in a pre-contact state. The barbarity of blacks in a pre-contact state is well documented by the explorers. But to get back to your point about Iceland, if it is this ethno-state that all whites want, but no one wants to visit, I would point out to you that I know many people who are moving to Hungary because it is explicitly a country that wishes to preserve its European heritage. This is something very attractive, even though Hungarian is one of the most difficult languages to learn on earth.
It's not European, that's why.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to have dropped from the sky. We don't know where it came from. But
somewhere in Central Asia, I imagine.
Yes. No, whites, I think, given the opportunity, will, once they have been given permission morally to express their inherent preferences, will gravitate in ever-increasing numbers to an area that reflects their genetic heritage. This is perfectly natural and normal. And once these opportunities present themselves, and once society at large stops saying these desires are somehow evil, these desires are hateful, once people are liberated from this nonsense about wanting to preserve their own heritage and people and culture, I think expressions of this kind will blossom and bloom, not just in the United States, but all around the white world. This is a natural expression of preference. Let me put it to you this way. You have children.
Yes.
I'm sure that you love your children more than any other children on earth.
Of course.
Now, is this because they are objectively superior to all other children? Of course not. They're not.
No, that's not true. My son is objectively more adorable.
By you.
I know.
Perhaps not by anyone else. You love them because they are yours.
Yes.
And you make no apologies for this. This is a kind of irrational tribalism that is expressed around the world. I think that most unbrainwashed people's natural inclinations is to have the same instinctive attachment to their extended family, which is this group of people that looks like them. This is likewise not an expression of distaste for others. I'm sure you get along fine with the children of others. You can be quite fond of the children of others, but yours come first. This to me is an almost perfect parallel of the natural, instinctive, and healthy preference for one's people in a biological sense. And when this is expressed, it need not reflect any kind of hostility, as I say. We can draw boundaries, and we can say, you can stay on that side, and we will have mutually satisfactory relations. We can visit each other, we can trade, but please let us pursue our own destiny unhampered by the embrace of people unlike ourselves. That, to me, is a splendid vision of humanity for all of us.
See, now, the problem I have is I agree with you that each person considers their own child most special, yes, and they would naturally treat them and their extended family with preferentially. But that's not something that we can ever action into law. And so it's not something... I mean, I would never say, right, the law has to favour my child and my family, because, well, it wouldn't be fair. So why should we do that in a racial way for our countries?
Well, imagine this. The law could be passed such as to... Imagine that your preference for your own children was trumpeted from the rooftops as a despicable form of familism, like racism, and the fact that you sacrificed for these children who just happened to be biologically yours. This is a terrible thing, and society required you to treat your children no differently from the children of anyone else. We can imagine such a society, and to me, that is just as unnatural, just as intrusive, and just as anti-human as the society we live in which we are told, no, your race, you must treat other races and other people, other groups, just as you would your own. To me, it is as unnatural and as against all of our natural instincts.
Yeah, but no one's making you treat anyone any particular way. I mean, no one's saying, well, who's doing this?
If I wish to employ people, or if I wish to serve people, if I wish to live with people. We have very, very strict laws. No, well, it does affect me personally. if I want to have a restaurant and I wish to serve only white people. I don't have that right. The government will say, no, you must admit these people. If I want to have a nightclub and I wish to attract young men and young white women so that they will meet each other and have young white children, oh my gosh, can you imagine just the sort of opprobrium that would attract?
I think they've labelled you as bad as it's going to get, to be honest. I don't think there's anything worse they can call you. But I mean, I'm actually on the side of bake the cake, to be honest. I know. I'm not a very good libertarian. I'm. Yeah. Oh, the gay cake. If you're going to serve the public, then I think you should serve the public indiscriminately.
Why? Why must I do business with people I prefer not to do business with?
Because because eventually what it'll do is it'll create a class of second-class citizens within their own country who can do very little about it. I mean, what if you're a black man and you're traveling across the country and you find yourself in this white ethno colony and you run out of fuel and everyone says, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to serve you because you're black. And then if you want to get a drink, no, I'm sorry, you can't have a drink because you're black. We don't serve blacks here. How is that acceptable?
Well, you are not harming anyone by refusing to deal with that person. He's no worse off than he was before. No, you're not harming him. If
he's a thirsty man and he needs a drink, you are harming him by refusing to serve him.
No, you have not made him any thirstier. You have left him in exactly the state he was. He may be disappointed, but he's not harmed. Now, it's like the question I raised earlier about my wishing to spend time in the company of some movie starlet. She has not harmed me. She has disappointed me if she says, get lost, geezer. Now, the whole question of the free market, if need be, will take care of those questions if there is a large demand for them. And in fact, nobody's going to starve to death because he wasn't able to.
I concede it's an unlikely scenario.
Very unlikely.
But it's just to show the innate flaws with the principles of the thing. And the problem I have as well is that I think that we should be striving to create a world with less prejudice and not more, and I think that what you're proposing will indeed create more prejudices. I mean you're aware that it will make people more identitarian. That's the point. I'm very much opposed to that, so I couldn't agree with you on this.
On the contrary, I think that if there were separate communities, if there were separate black communities that were governed by blacks, you would not have this constant friction of white police being asked to do what I think is the most difficult job in the world, or certainly the most difficult job in the United States, and that is to try to stop and prevent crime in black communities. All of this would go away if there was a kind of understanding that institutional superstructure should be one in which people are governed by people like themselves. I think that the resentment against whites would be far less if blacks, as a routine matter, were governed by people who were of the same race, and the same with whites. It would be that makes. I
think Africa's disproven your thesis there. I mean, they are absolutely incensed at the white man. But Robert Mugabe made his entire career on it. I think that even if you had even if you were to balkanize the United States into smaller racial ethno-states, I think that I think it's the neo-Marxists who would continue to foment this anyway. And it would, I mean, they called the United States a white supremacist country when Barack Obama was the president. So they're going to find an excuse somehow why the failure of the black ethno-state is the white man's fault. I honestly think it's philosophy that's the problem, rather than race with these people.
See, Robert Mugabe proves my point. Robert Mugabe wanted to kick the white man out so that the black man could be sovereign in his nation. Yes. And that was the solution that he sought. He cut off his nose to spite his face, of course, because it was the white farmers who were the source of great wealth in that country. But that was his preference, and that expresses, I think, a common desire among people of all races. They wish to be governed by people like themselves. Now, as far as a balkanized America, yes, you would find people. you continue to find people who say that everything that has ever gone wrong for non-white people anywhere around the world in any time of history is the fault of white people. This is a sickness that many white people have. White people love to feel good about themselves by feeling bad about being white. And this is something unique to whites. And I don't know how that sickness can be cured. But if it were clear that blacks were really working at their own level, that they were masters in their own house, this kind of objection would be much, much harder to make. And I believe that that would lead to at least a reconciliation with the fact of, eventually, of racial differences. Now, I understand that you agree that blacks and whites on average do not have the same IQ, and that there's a genetic contribution to this. You concede that point, do you not?
It is to every person, yes. Your IQ is, as I understand it, the scientific thinking at the moment is that IQ is potential given to you by your genetics, and it's up to you to fulfill that potential. Education, poverty, these things all have various effects on varying IQ levels across white populations, for example. Across Britain, we can see this, and there have been studies show. So yes, I do agree that there is a genetic component to IQ, and it's a potential you have to reach, as I understand it, anyway.
Well, and that the genetic potential from race to race is simply not the same.
On average,
yes. This is something that the left refuses to recognize, and I always find it refreshing to find a left liberal, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing it by using those terms, who concedes this point. You're not the first I've met, by the way. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. But once we recognize this has an enormous social implications. In the United States, as you're probably aware, there is a tremendous amount of energy that is expended trying to eliminate these gaps. We have huge meetings of what I think are essentially snake oil salesmen, of public schools teachers and educators trying to come up with ways to ensure that whites do as well as Asians, for example, in the public schools. This is effort completely and utterly, totally wasted. And as you know, in the United States, every time there is any kind of achievement, whether it's running a Fortune 500 company or being admitted to Harvard or getting Academy Awards or whatever it is, everyone is counting the black faces and the Asian faces and the Hispanic faces. Yeah. This is nonsense. Oddly enough, this bean counting, this face counting goes by the boards if it is a professional football team, professional basketball team. Everyone quietly accepts, well, gosh, I guess they're just better at that than white people, or certainly better than Asians or Mexicans. How many Mexican linebackers are there? Yeah, none. But in every other field of endeavor, we are always wringing our hands and agonizing over the fact that blacks are not represented in sufficient numbers. Hispanics are not represented in sufficient numbers. All of this is a terrible, terrible drag, not only on a smooth functioning of society, but it's all part of this instilling of guilt that you described earlier, according to which whites are blamed when non-whites do not achieve the same level. This is psychological poison that I believe drives an enormous amount of what you decry as this social justice warrior depredations on the American psyche.
Oh, I mean, I'm completely in agreement with you on that point. I totally agree that that's a good term for it, racial bean counting, is absurd. I don't care about the racial representation in any way, shape, or form. I care from meritocratic representation, as in, and for sports are a great example. I don't care that the champion Chinese chess players are Chinese. I don't care that the champion powerlifters are Icelandic. I don't care that the champion runners are sub-Saharan. And for the same with acting and any other vocation in life. As long as it's the best person and they are demonstrating excellence, I really don't care. But okay, so we're coming to the end now. So let's change gears slightly. The alt-right. There is a narrative on the far left that people like myself, sort of centre-left liberals, are somehow converting people to the alt-right. Is that something you would agree with, or do you think that people are finding the alt-right through other means?
Well, people talk about being red-pilled, that I would call this white people gaining some sort of form of racial consciousness. I think reality is the most powerful red pill. More and more white people are waking up to the crisis that they, as a group, face, certainly in the United States and really all around the white world. Immigration is reducing us to a minority. And the current dogma is that whites are to blame if non-whites do not perform at the same level of whites. This is ultimately a scenario that will lead to our extinction 200 years from now. If it is condemned to if the idea that whites have the right to remain a majority, and if whites should prefer or are allowed to prefer to continue their own race by marrying people of the same race, if all of these ideas are condemned, eventually we will disappear. Ultimately, it's a question of survival. And certainly in the United States and around the world, more and more white people recognize that not only is our culture something that depends on us biologically, but our biological continuity, something even more fundamental, is threatened by all of the forces that have been put in motion by modernity. And that if we are to survive as a people with a distinct culture, we have the obligation, we have the duty to stop these forces while we have the time to do so. And I don't think that it's something that is necessarily in reaction to the identitarians on the left. This notion of whites as a distinct people with a distinct destiny goes back hundreds of years. This is a temporary diminution, a temporary unilateral disarmament on the part of whites, whereas every other group continues to think that they do have a collective identity that they will pursue, if need be, at our expense.
Right, it's interesting how you've mentioned this a couple of times, and you brought up Shaka Zulu a bit earlier. As the innate savagery of the black man, I suppose. How do you feel that's any different to the innate savagery of the Northern European 2,000 years ago?
Oh, probably not much. Well, I don't know much about the Northern European 2,000 years ago. You probably don't either.
I actually know a fair amount about them. They were
2,000 years ago?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for example, Aristotle considered the Northern Europeans to be subnormal in IQ. He considered them to be idiots. His opinion was that the Northern Europeans were the stupidest of races, but they were the freest. The Asiatics were the smartest of races, but they were the most subservient. And the Greeks had the best of both worlds. Well, the Greeks, as far as we can tell, are not that different biologically from the Northern Europeans that Aristotle was criticizing. No. Remember, was it Tacitus? He found the Germanics quite admirable. He admired the way they treated women. He admired the kind of manliness of their society. He certainly didn't consider them barbaric perhaps barbaric from a cultural point of view, but very manly and admirable as in terms of individuals. But look, what white people are like 2,000 just to interject there. I mean that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it? Because I mean, if we think that our culture is an expression of our race, yes, then how is it we explain the revolution in culture in Northern Europe from and just unbelievably primitive barbarians, while the Asiatics were at the height of their cultural power, to being the complete opposite? If culture is so closely tied to race, I think it's not. I think that there are societal developments that happen, and I think that Jared Diamond was more right when he said Northern Europe was basically fortuitous. Oh,
Jared Diamond, what a fraudster.
Come on, you can't say that.
I'm not sure he even believes what he himself says.
Oh, then you're agreeing with the far left now.
Well, I'm not sure about that. The people who built Stonehenge were not complete savages. They built that 4,000 years ago. That reflected a certain kind of organization that I think we have to recognize. And this is not a completely unique phenomenon. The fact is, environment, of course, counts for a great deal. Look at the difference between North Korea and South Korea. Those people have been separated only since the 1950s. You have a very different culture, a very different level of development. Of course, environment and environmental degradation, environmental deprivation can have a huge effect. But just as the reunification of Germany showed, if you are talking about people of the same stock, the same genetic heritage, then you can reestablish a kind of unity in just a few generations, not even just a generation or two. The same would happen in Korea if those countries are reunited. You will not have that kind of merging of peoples if you're trying to cross some difficult racial barrier.
I'm not sure that's true, but we've come to the end of the hour, so I'll thank you very much for joining me, and I'm sure that the comment section on this will be a very interesting thing to read.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on your program.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.